All right, so today we're doing 3.4. Whoa, Larry. 3.4, which is the quadratic formula. Just so I can show it to you really fast, that's the quadratic formula right there. Okay. The first thing I'm going to show you is how you actually get there. So the idea with the quadratic formula is, as you can probably tell, you're trying to find what x is, which is what we've been doing this whole unit. So you start with a regular equation like this, where you have a trinomial and it's equal to 0. So see how it says a, b, c? A is just the first coefficient, b is the second, and c is the constant in that term, or in that expression. So for example, if I had like 3x squared plus 4x minus 2, okay, that would be a, that would be b, that would be c. The other thing worth noting is that these are always when it's equal to 0. If you had something like this, let's even make it 2. Okay. If you had an equation like this, you just need to rearrange it so that the equation is equal to 0, because then you can actually solve using quadratic formula. So before we get into some solutions, I'm going to show you where this comes from. So we have our general expression right here, our general equation. We're going to rearrange it. Our goal is to make it so x is isolated. It's a little tough because we have x squared and x, but we can do it using completing the square. The first thing we're going to do is divide everything by a. So then we end up looking at this. The a simplifies, and we have divided by a on those two terms. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to take this term and move it to the right, so it becomes negative ca. Next, what we're going to do, because we have this set up, we're going to complete the square. So we add b over 2a squared to both sides. We figured that out, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to take our perfect square trinomial and factor it to become this. The other thing we did in this step, which we changed it from being 2a, we expanded out that square. So it became b squared over 4a squared. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that the two terms on the right, these two, those two terms, have the same denominator, 4a squared. So we multiplied c, got it to that. Now what we're going to do, because we have the square here, I'm going to square root both sides. Okay. Because these have the same denominator, they can actually combine into one fraction. We square root both sides, so that gets rid of the exponent there. And it becomes plus minus, really important, the square root of this. Then we get rid of the brackets, and we're also going to simplify, what are we going to simplify? The denominator, so 4a squared, square rooted, becomes just 2a. And then the very last thing, this plus b over 2a, we're going to move to the other side. So it becomes minus b. It would be over 2a, but this is over 2a as well. So it can just be over one fraction, so it becomes our glorious quadratic formula right there. It's useful to memorize quadratic formula because you're going to be using it so often, but my guess is that most teachers let you use it and have a copy of it as a reference, and it's almost always on formula sheets for exams and stuff like that. Okay, so let's get into like what this is actually used for. It's used for solving for x. That's it. When you have an expression, or an equation, okay, where it has the equal sign, we're going to use it to solve for x. We right now have 3 tools in our arsenal for how to solve for x. We can factor, we can complete the square, and we can use quadratic formula. Let's look at these 2 methods first. We already know how to do them, so I'm not going to show you the steps. So let's say that this was our equation, okay? X squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. If I factored it, it's pretty easy to factor, right? It factors pretty nicely, and I get x is equal to negative 1. Completing the square is a little harder, but not too bad. I rearrange, isolate, complete the square, and I end up getting, again, x is equal to negative 1. Took a little bit longer steps, but not too bad. Quadratic formula, we're going to go through all the steps to show it. It ends up taking a while, and then I'm going to talk about which method I like to use. So, quadratic formula. I wrote the formula here, and then I'm going to take all the values that are in the original equation up here, and I'm going to sub them in. So remember, we have a, b, c in order. A in this case is going to be 1 because there's nothing in front of the x squared, so it's just 1. B is 2, c is 1. So I'm going to sub in the numbers. I sub them in right here, and we can see them. So we have, this is where the b went, the negative 2. Keep that negative, it's important. because it's negative b in the original equation. We subbed in the rest over here, and then we just simplify. Okay. The next step for simplifying is over here. This ended up in the radical, ended up being 0. The denominator was 2, and this is minus 2. So we can just cancel that out, no big deal. I end up getting negative 2 divided by 2, which is just negative 1. What you hopefully notice is that, don't worry about that, is that all the answers were the same. All three methods work. There are some questions where factoring doesn't work. That's only when you're going to get radical solutions or like weird decimals. But factoring will always work if you know how to factor it. Completing the square and quadratic formula work even if it's radical or different. My suggestion to you is that factoring is your first step. It is the fastest and easiest to do as long as the question can be factored. So try to factor it if you can. But then if you notice after a second that it's tough because it's a prime number or whatever, then you're just going to skip ahead to either completing the square or quadratic formula. Personally, well, if there's a question on the test asks you to do one way or the other, obviously do that. I personally prefer quadratic formula. The reason for this is when you complete the square, you usually get a lot of fractions and you have to make them have the common denominator, and that usually takes me a while, so I don't like completing the square. Quadratic formula looks like it takes a lot of steps, but that's just because I showed everything. As you get more and more practice with it, you'll find it's actually pretty fast. All right, so let's do another practice question showing all our steps, okay? So this is the equation we have, and we need to solve for x. That's what the question will say, or factor, whatever. So the first thing I'm going to do, rearrange, because I need it to equal 0. So let's move these two on the other side. So it's going to be 3x squared minus 4x minus 1 equals 0. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out the quadratic formula and sub in the numbers. As you get more practiced, you don't have to write out the formula. You can just start subbing in numbers yourself. I'm going to show it to you because we're just starting. So x is equal to negative b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's sub in the numbers. X is equal to positive 4. So I'm going to look, this is the equation we're looking at. This one doesn't matter anymore. Positive 4 plus minus the square root of 16 minus 4. We'll write 4 squared. You'll notice the negative didn't really matter because when we square it, it'll go away. So 4 times 3 times negative 1 divided by 2 times negative 1. Oh, sorry, 3. Let me double check that. B, A, C. Good. So now I'm going to simplify it a little bit. 16. This becomes 4 times 3 is 12. Negative times negative positive. Divided by 6. X is equal to 4 plus minus the square root of, what's that? 28 divided by 6. Now what we can do, you have a couple options. If you want to simplify this into a decimal to find your decimal answer, most teachers want you to keep it as a radical to make it nicer. I prefer that as well. So we're going to turn it into a mixed radical to make it the best we can. So we're going to use 4. So it's going to be x is equal to 4 plus minus 2 square root 7 all over 6. And again, that can reduce. X is equal to 2 plus minus square root 7 over 3. So this will give us 2 answers. If you want to write them both out, you can. It's up to you. So 2 plus root 7 over 3, or 2 minus root 7 over 3. If you had to find a specific answer, we would actually put this in the calculator and find it, but those are the 2 answers. Now, the other thing I want to point out is the number of possible solutions. So when you're doing quadratic formula, there are 3 possible solutions you can get. You can get one like we just did, where we ended up with 2. The plus minus thing is what creates the one or the other. One will be positive, one will be negative of the radical sign. The other option is the one we did in the example, where because we square rooted a 0, we ended up just getting one answer. Okay? There's a third option. The third option, and I'm going to make an example, like a random example right now. Okay. In this situation, there would be no solution. The reason there'd be no solution is because we cannot square root a radical. This is the same as when we did the completing the square and you get something like this. Okay? Because when you try and square root it, it's not actually possible to square root the negative, so this has no solution. This situation is the same thing. Once you get to this point in the question and you realize that you're square rooting a negative, you should stop. Stop wasting your time. Don't solve the rest of it and just say no solution. Okay? So when you do questions, you might get 2 answers, you might get 1 answer, or you might get 0 answers, the no solution situation. We're going to talk a little bit more in the next video about this and what it's called and what it means and how to work with it. But that's the basics. That's how you do quadratic formula.